Reid's mornings rarely deviated. The insistent, chirping alarm sliced through the pre-dawn quiet, pulling him from the edges of a dream he could never quite recall. He'd rise, the worn floorboards of his small apartment protesting softly underfoot, and perform the same ritual: strong, black coffee, a piece of toast, and the drone of the local news channel offering a predictable litany of minor crimes and weather forecasts. His work at the print shop, a steady but uninspiring rhythm of ink and paper, filled the hours until dusk. There was a quiet satisfaction in the precise alignment of a brochure, the crispness of a freshly printed page, but no thrill. Life, for Reid, was a carefully maintained machine, predictable and largely unexamined. That meticulous order shattered with the arrival of a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing an unfamiliar crest. It wasn't a bill, nor an advertisement. The return address indicated a legal firm several states away, a place Reid had never heard of. He slid it open with the same precision he applied to a stack of flyers, a flicker of mild curiosity stirring within him. The letter was formal, concise, and utterly bewildering. It spoke of a distant relative, a great-aunt named Elara, whose sudden, mysterious passing had left him, Reid, as the sole inheritor of his estate. An estate that consisted, primarily, of a secluded cabin deep within a forgotten stretch of forest. Reid read the letter 3 times, the words blurring, then sharpening into stark reality. He hadn't seen Elara since he was a child, a vague memory of a stern face and an unsettling quiet. The firm's representative, a sharp-voiced woman who called him later that day, offered few details beyond the legal necessities. She spoke of the cabin's remote location, its age, and the necessity of his presence to sign papers. There was an edge to her tone, a barely concealed impatience that suggested this was an inconvenient task, not a solemn duty. Reid, despite his initial reluctance, felt a determined pull. A cabin. An inheritance. A break from the humdrum. It was an unexpected turn, a jarring note in his carefully composed symphony. The journey itself was a descent into an increasingly unfamiliar landscape. The interstate highways gave way to state routes, then county roads, then finally, to narrow, crumbling asphalt that snaked through dense woodland. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, pressing in on the car. Miles passed without a single sign of human habitation. The trees, ancient and gnarled, formed a canopy that swallowed the sky, plunging the road into a perpetual twilight. The sunlight, when it managed to pierce through, cast shifting, spectral patterns on the decaying leaves that carpeted the forest floor. He passed a few derelict structures, the skeletons of forgotten farms, their windows like empty eye sockets staring out at nothing. The silence became profound, broken only by the crunch of his tires on loose gravel and the distant, mournful cry of an unseen bird. Then, through a sudden break in the trees, as the road briefly hugged a rocky coastline, a stark silhouette rose against the bruised sky. It was an abandoned lighthouse, its white stone weathered to a dull gray, its lantern room a gaping, shattered maw. No light shone from it, no warning beacon. It stood as a silent, desolate monument to an era long past, a sentinel guarding a forgotten stretch of sea. The sight sent a shiver down Reid's spine, a cold premonition that settled deep in his gut. This place felt not just remote, but utterly cut off, outside the boundaries of the world he knew. Turning inland again, the road narrowed further, becoming little more than 2 muddy tracks weaving through an impossibly dense thicket. He consulted the faded map the legal firm had provided, the ink bleeding slightly at the folds. The cabin, according to the crude markings, was nestled at the end of this forgotten path. The determination that had fueled his drive began to curdle into a profound unease. The forest pressed in, an almost physical presence, silent and watchful. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees receded slightly, revealing a clearing. And there it was. The cabin. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, hunkering low to the ground as if trying to disappear back into the earth. Overgrown vines, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the structure, threatening to pull it down entirely. A rusted, leaning porch swing hung by one chain, swaying almost imperceptibly in a breeze Reid couldn't feel. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered the last echoes of his journey. The air here was different, carrying the faint, metallic scent of damp earth and something else, something subtly acrid, like old, stagnant water or forgotten iron. Reid gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The cabin wasn't just isolated, it felt like an anchor dropped into a sea of forgotten things, a place where the world had simply moved on and left something behind. He was here, at the threshold of whatever this inheritance truly was, and for the first time, he felt truly alone. Reid's mornings at the cabin had fallen into a rhythm, albeit one punctuated by the groaning timbers and sighing winds that seemed to be the ancient structure's constant companions. He'd rise with the sun, the dense forest outside his window still shrouded in a dew-kissed mist, and make his strong, black coffee. The silence here was different from his apartment, deeper, heavier, often broken by the rustle of unseen creatures or the sudden, sharp crack of a branch. He spent his days trying to impose order on the chaos of inherited clutter, sorting through dusty boxes, and attempting to mend the cabin's myriad small imperfections. He told himself it was therapeutic, a way to anchor himself in this new, unsettling reality. The first few weeks were a blur of dust motes dancing in sunbeams and the persistent scent of mildew and pine. He'd convinced himself that the occasional, almost imperceptible shift of a framed photograph on a shelf, or the faint, high-pitched whine that seemed to emanate from the walls, were just the cabin settling. An old house, he'd reasoned, was a living thing, full of its own peculiar complaints. Then the disturbances grew more insistent. One afternoon, while he was in the small kitchen wrestling with a stubborn faucet, he heard a distinct thump from the floor above, followed by a dragging sound. It was too heavy, too deliberate, to be a branch falling or the house groaning. He froze, wrench in hand, listening. The dragging stopped. He called out, his voice swallowed by the thick silence. Nothing. He ascended the creaking stairs, heart thrumming a quick, anxious beat against his ribs, but the upstairs rooms were empty, undisturbed. No open windows, no fallen objects. Just the pervasive smell of aged wood and damp earth. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, attributing it to fatigue. The next morning, his coffee mug, which he'd meticulously washed and placed on the drying rack, was sitting squarely on the edge of the fireplace hearth. It was still damp, a small ring of moisture beneath it. He lived alone. He knew he'd put it on the rack. He picked it up, the ceramic cool beneath his fingers, and placed it back in its rightful spot, his movements slow, deliberate. He tried to laugh it off, a lapse in memory, perhaps. A seed of doubt, tiny and sharp, had begun to sprout. Driven by a growing need for answers, or at least a distraction from the cabin's unsettling atmosphere, Reid decided to tackle the one room he'd largely avoided, a small, windowless den tucked away at the back of the house. It was crammed with boxes and shrouded furniture, a mausoleum of forgotten things. The wood was intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to writhe in the dim light. A small, tarnished silver lock held it shut, but the key was missing. He found a rusty pry bar in a toolbox and, with a grunt of effort, forced the lid open. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed linens, were a collection of antique photographs, stern-faced men and women in stiff collars and long dresses, their eyes seeming to follow him. He recognized a faint family resemblance in one of the women. Beneath the photos, wrapped in brittle parchment, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in perpetual flight. It felt strangely heavy in his palm. And then, at the very bottom, beneath another layer of linen, lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth, and the pages within were filled with cramped, spidery script, almost illegible in places. He carefully opened the journal. The ink was faded, the paper brittle, but he could make out a recurring symbol drawn in the margins, an intertwined knot of 3 lines, identical to the one on the locket he'd found when his relative had died. The cryptic words gnawed at him. He needed air, distance from the suffocating history contained within the chest. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, a vague memory of a local landmark pulling him. After a long, winding drive down a barely maintained track that eventually opened to the churning, gray expanse of the ocean, he found it. The abandoned lighthouse stood stark against the bruised sky, a skeletal finger pointing towards the roiling clouds. Its paint was flaking, its glass long shattered, and the wind howled through its empty lantern room like a mournful spirit. The salt-laced air whipped at his face, carrying with it the scent of decay and the relentless roar of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks below. He walked around its base, the metal groaning in the wind, the rusted ladder leading up to the broken lantern room seeming to beckon and warn simultaneously. The solitude here was profound, yet it didn't offer the solace he sought. He clutched the journal, its worn leather cover digging into his palm, the strange symbol seeming to pulse under his touch. He'd rise with the sun, the dense forest outside his window still shrouded in a dew-kissed mist, and make his strong, dark coffee. But the comfortable monotony was a fragile thing, a thin veneer over a growing unease. The subtle shift started first. A book he'd left on the kitchen table would appear on the mantelpiece, its spine facing inward. A ceramic mug, rinsed and placed on the drying rack, would be found on the floor, intact, as if gently set down. He'd blame himself, of course, his own absent-mindedness, the lingering effects of disrupted sleep. He'd attribute the faint, acrid smell that sometimes permeated the main room to a decaying animal outside, or perhaps the dampness of the old wood. Then came the sounds. Not the familiar creaks of an old house settling, but distinct, deliberate noises. A soft scrape across the floorboards above him when he was alone downstairs. A faint, wet thud from the pantry, like something weighty and soft hitting the shelf, only for him to find nothing amiss. One evening, as the rain lashed against the windows, he heard a sound like a shallow, ragged breath drawn right beside his ear, too close to be the wind. He spun, his heart leaping into his throat, but the empty air was cold against his cheek. Sleep became a battleground. He'd drift off only to be jarred awake by the sensation of someone standing over him, a pressure in the room that was almost physical. His reflection in the window at night began to look wrong. Distorted, elongated, with eyes that seemed too wide, too deep. He'd blink, and it would normalize, leaving him to wonder if he was simply exhausted, or if the cabin itself was starting to play tricks on his mind. The rationalizations finally shattered one afternoon. He was in the small study, attempting to read, when a heavy, antique-framed photograph of his distant relative, the one who had owned the cabin, slid from its hook on the wall. It didn't fall. It slid, slowly, deliberately, as if an unseen hand had carefully unlatched it, then let it drop. The glass cracked with a sharp report that echoed through the quiet room. Reid stared at the shattered image, his relative's unsmiling face now fractured, distorted by the broken glass. The cabin was alive, and it was watching him. Determination, fueled by a terrifying curiosity, began to override his fear. He needed answers. He couldn't leave, not without understanding what had happened here, what was happening to him. He started with the cabin itself, meticulously searching every drawer, every forgotten corner. He found an old, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the study, its pages brittle and yellowed. The script was faded, erratic, belonging to his distant relative. The entries were sparse at first, detailing mundane cabin life. Reid knew he had to go there. He drove the winding, overgrown roads, the forest pressing in on all sides, until the trees finally thinned, revealing the stark, salt-sprayed coastline. Inside, the spiral staircase groaned under his weight, the wind whistling through broken panes like a mournful song. He found nothing obvious, no hidden archives, but as he climbed, his fingers brushing against the cold stone, he noticed something carved into the wall near the top, almost hidden by centuries of grime and moss. It was a symbol, a jagged, incomplete circle with 3 lines radiating outwards, like claws reaching. The lineage. The fragments began to coalesce into a terrifying mosaic. There was a desperate plea for forgiveness, a mention of a forgotten oath that had come due. Reid's own name, his family name, appeared several times, linked to the lineage and the debt. He saw a reference to the land itself, described as ancient earth, demanding its due. He stood at the top of the abandoned lighthouse, the wind whipping his hair. The endless gray ocean stretching before him. He wasn't just living in a haunted house, he was part of a story, a terrible, unfolding narrative generations in the making. The phenomena weren't random, they were demands. And the entity, whatever it was closing in. And now, it was Reid's turn.